Good afternoon. My name's Bruno Waterfield. I'm the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, which is a London newspaper. So, please do read it. This debate, Ukraine, Cold War rebooted, is a debate that I personally have been really looking forward to the most this weekend. I work in Brussels. I've been writing about Ukraine quite a lot. I've been writing about this current crisis. It's something that people talk about a lot in Brussels. They're talking about it in all the foreign ministries, in all the capitals in Europe. It's widely seen as being at least the most serious foreign policy challenge, certainly for European countries since the former Yugoslavia. So it's seen as a significant moment in the sense that it will redefine European policy in its neighbourhood, redefine relationships between Europe and Russia and Europe, Russia and the world and Russia. A lot of claims are already being made for it. People are talking about a new Cold War. NATO, rather conveniently, as Afghanistan ends, has discovered a new sense of mission there. People are talking about the Cold War. It's seen as a very, very significant and dangerous moment, and indeed it does seem to be a dangerous moment when we look at what happened with the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. So it's an important moment, but yet we've seen that there are quite high levels of mistrust sometimes between European powers. Unity has been maintained in Europe, but there's some debate about how united Europe actually is and the content of that united approach. It's raised the whole debate about geopolitics and realist foreign policy as opposed to sort of idealism and principles and ideas of self-determination. So it's a really, really fundamental debate. I'm very pleased to have a really good panel who I'm going to introduce in the order in which they speak. First of all, we'll hear from Tara McCormack. She lectures on international politics at the University of Leicester. Tara is the author of Critique, Security and Power, which was published in 2009, which is a good read. I recommend it. After Tara, we'll hear from Will Vernon, who's a producer at BBC News. He's been reporting from Ukraine. He's been reporting from Ukraine a lot. So he's going to give us a real impression of what is going on, how Ukrainians see it, and what is actually happening on the ground. He's speaking in a personal capacity because BBC journalists aren't allowed to have opinions. No. But I think we'll hear. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. His reports have been very illuminating. Then after Will, we'll have Ivan Krastev, who's a Bulgarian. He's one of Eastern Europe's most interesting thinkers. He's a regular here at the Battle of Ideas. He was speaking earlier on today. He's the chair of the Centre of Liberal Studies. He's had a book out this spring called Democracy Disrupted, the Global Politics on Protest. Speaking last in order will be Katarina Wulczuk. She's Polish. She's a reader in politics and international studies at the Centre for Russian, European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Birmingham. So she's an expert on relationships between the European Union, Europe and post-Soviet Eurasian states. So her expertise is going to be very useful, but we're beginning with Tara. Tara.
Okay, I'll rattle through this as the timing is very strict. I've got 3 points. First, is this a new Cold War? No, not yet, but do be warned that many Western policymakers were very, very excited to see what happened in the Ukraine, and you could hear positive signs of relief at the recent NATO conference. Finally, a clear enemy. 2, who caused the crisis? My argument is that America and the EU caused the crisis. The EU bears primary responsibility, and America then exacerbated the problem. I'm not arguing that Putin is a saint. The point is, how do we understand the start of the crisis? My third point, which I guess is the main substantive point, is that this is a clear example of what I think is a very, very dangerous trend of what I'm going to call accidental foreign policy. I'm going to focus on the EU, but I'm happy to talk about American policy later. And I think we can see this in two ways. First of all, the broader framework for EU foreign policy and the specific actions in the Ukraine. First of all, EU foreign policy has been framed of being what the academics call normative foreign policy that isn't driven by interests, material interests, strategic interests, etc., but by the desire to enhance people's rights, law, democracy. Now, this is the framework for all EU policy, aspects of EU foreign policy, trade agreements, relationship agreements with neighbours, etc. The EU sets conditions, but conditions that stipulate that a country must, for example, alter its justice system or the way the police work. Now, the real problem is that this form of policy is explicitly understood to be post-political, non-interventionary, one which simply facilitates or provides a positive framework for states. There's no imagined impact here, apart from a completely benevolent one. But the problem is that in all existing states, there are real political, material interests and disagreements. And EU foreign policy explicitly refuses to recognise this. And I think this is very problematic. There is an absolute rejection or a refusal to understand that policies dictated by a powerful external force can have a real material political impact in a state. And the EU also seems to willfully ignore external political realities. Again, imagining a fiction that its policies can only be seen as a kind of benevolent, facilitating framework. And in the context of the Ukraine, you have the post-Cold War agreement between the West and Russia, and whereas Russia is frequently told, Russia is portrayed as tearing up the post-Cold War order, it's really the EU that has kind of trampled over the agreement that Ukraine would remain outside of NATO and the EU. John Mearsheimer, the American realist who's written very well on this crisis, has called it Geopolitics 101. You know, you don't have to be a kind of genius to work out this is a problem. And finally, I want to talk about the specific actions that the EU has the specific things the EU has done in terms of this accidental foreign policy. I think we've had an extraordinary, and I would actually argue scandalous, decision by 3 EU foreign ministers who essentially took it upon themselves to travel to Ukraine and depose the existing government. I don't think it's going too far to call this a coup, in my opinion. Now, I don't know if it, again, was naivety or a willful refusal to consider that deposing the sitting government actually may have some kind of quite serious political impact within a state. So I guess the point that I want to conclude on is that one of the really worrying things at the moment is that EU foreign policy seems to be being conducted almost in some kind of fantasy world that has very little relationship or engagement with real political conditions. Okay, that's it.
Well, Tara has set the standard for speed speaking. Thank you very much. Will.
Thanks. So my analysis of the Ukraine situation is basically based on what I've seen and the reporting in which I've been involved in Ukraine. So I've been producing news coverage from Ukraine since 2012, when I first traveled there for the Euros, for the football. And at that time, Ukraine, if you take a city in Ukraine like Donetsk, at that time Donetsk was a very happy, affluent, confident city full of Ukrainian flags and people having a lovely time, with a brand new airport, open with great fanfare, new hotels, new stadium. There was very little hint of any divisions or tensions. And if you sort of fast forward to last month, my last trip to Donetsk, it was a city under bombardment, deserted, basically just a few pensioners left, boarded up shops, people, the city centre being bombed, people being killed every day, and the airport had collapsed. And at the same time, in Kiev, there was a sort of increasingly fractious government that seemed to be dominated by nationalists. So we have to ask how this happened. So I'm going to start by explaining how I see the crisis. So it's three stages for me. It's the Maidan, and then the annexation of Crimea, and finally the conflict in Donbass. And the big question is this more of a local issue, or is it part of a sort of wider East-West struggle? As in, is this a proxy war, a fight between the EU and the West on one hand and a resurgent Russia on the other, or is it a local conflict? And was the Maidan actually a culmination of an unfinished revolution in 2003, the Orange Revolution, and sort of the final result of decades of internal divisions? So as ever, the answer, based on what I've seen and experienced, is a bit of both. So in terms of things that suggest the Ukraine crisis is a local issue, when I visited in 2013, the first visit, the program we did was on an internally divided Ukraine. So on the one hand, you've got an ethnically and linguistically Russian East, and on the other, a sort of European-leaning Ukrainian-speaking West. And so the industrial Russian-speaking East was repopulated by ethnic Russians by Stalin following the famine in the 1930s, as opposed to the European-leaning East, which was, until the Second World War, part of Poland. So there were clear divisions. And during the Maidan movement, the east of the country was constantly overlooked. None of the protest leaders tried to reach out to the east, even though they knew that it was where President Yanukovych, the ousted president, and his party enjoyed the most support. And when the new parliament sat for the first time, they actually introduced, but didn't pass, a bill to remove Russian as a regional language. And this was incredibly, divisive, and really made Eastern Ukrainians incredibly angry. And they didn't reach out to ethnic Russians, to Crimeans, to Eastern Ukrainians. And people in the East felt as though they're treated as second-class citizens. And this is something that constantly came up in conversations that we had with people as we traveled around Ukraine throughout the crisis. And local grievances did crop up quite often, and the language issue was a real concern for people, that they felt that Russian speakers were not, accepted by the rest of Ukraine. And in addition, despite repeated accusations by the Ukrainian authorities that the uprising in eastern Ukraine was Russian troops, from what I saw, the vast majority of fighters, of supporters, activists were locals. They were Ukrainian citizens, ethnic Russians, a lot of them, but still Ukrainian passport holders. So if we look at the sort of larger scale proxy war issue, how can we characterize it in this way? Of course, there are certain factors that point to this being a new Cold War, pro-Ukrainian West Ukraine, pro-Russian Eastern Ukraine supported by Russia and the EU in each case. And Russia has shown by its actions that it's clearly concerned about having a pro-Western potential NATO member right on its border. And Russia is supporting the movement in Eastern Ukraine. Several senior rebels told me in private conversations that, yes, Russia's helping weapons, arms, money. They didn't quite go as far as admitting that there were regular Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine, although, of course, we know there are and were. So Russia certainly has had a part to play in this crisis from the very beginning. And we know that President Yanukovych constantly called Putin throughout the Maidan crisis. We know Russian troops annexed Crimea, and Russian state-controlled media, which is essentially propaganda, has reached sort of fever pitch in its attacks on Ukraine. So Russia's actions in Ukraine and its so-called near abroad since the rise of Putin are due to a number of reasons, which I'm sure we'll go into in the discussion. Similarly, the EU and the West had a role in this from very early on. Cathy Ashton visiting the Maidan, Victoria Nuland discussing who the next president of Ukraine could be. So that's Western involvement. But then again, the premise of EU involvement or influence in the Ukrainian crisis is a tricky one, I think, because in terms of my experiences, the EU has very little significance to most people in Ukraine. I mean, they don't cite it in conversations, and closer integration into the EU, they just don't feature in political discourse. So the Maidan did start as a protest movement when Yanukovych didn't sign the association agreement with the EU. But they actually started to die down in December. And it was actually in January when the police very violently broke up a student demonstration that they were reignited. And when they were reignited, it changed from sort of this protest movement against the refusal to sign the agreement with the EU into an anti-government movement. I'll wrap up. Into an anti-government movement. And, you know, there were all sorts of concerns that people had: corruption, bad roads, a whole range of grievances that people cited during the protest, that the EU just basically disappeared from the whole discussion. I'd better stop there.
Ivan.
Thank you very much. I'm in a certain way in a privileged position because you two different views. One is that everything should be explained by the politics of European Union or Russia. You can go one day. The other, there is also local politics. And before making my 3 points, I just want to say that it was not that the Ukrainians were facing a question to be part of the EU or not. The story was that there were two different integration projects going there, and what was destroyed was the geopolitical ambiguity in which Ukraine have been basically living after the end of the Cold War. Ukraine should have either go closer to the European Union or join the Eurasian Union. So from this point of view, what was not given to Ukraine is staying in between. And this was coming from the European Union, but also from Russia. Basically, the pressure on Ukraine coming from President Putin was not that they should not join European Union, the pressure was that they should join Eurasian Union. I'm saying this because if you, in January, you're going to talk about European politicians and what they expect, that there were two things that they believe that are not going to happen. They believe that first, Russia is not going to allow Western control over Crimea. This was obviously for everybody who was following this. And secondly, they were sure that Russia is not going to annex Crimea. And it was the second one that turned to be wrong. So it was not the fact that Russia kept control over Crimea, it was the annexation that came as a big surprise. And it came as a big surprise because before it, Russia was very resentful, but Russia was always very much trying to play the legality of the international order, very much attacking the West for this. For going illegally. Secondly, this was kind of the end of the Europe's hope that economic interdependence makes war impossible. That the more we're economically interdependent, basically the more conflict is over. I'm saying this because there are 2 points which I want to make. One is to try to understand why basically European Union was so surprised by Russia did, and also why after that Russia was very much surprised by the European reaction. European Union was surprised for 3, in my view, very simple reasons. First, European Union tried to believe, and we managed to convince ourselves, that everything that is happening after the Cold War was a win-win game. Everything is, there is no losers. But listen, from the Russian point of view, it was not such a big win. And there was very few people that have been nostalgic for Soviet communism, but there were many people that have been basically nostalgic for Soviet Union as a big power being respected, which has nothing to do with communism. So from this point of view, psychologically, when you go and tell to some people that they feel that they're losers, that they're living in a non-loser world, these people are not basically very much charmed by your message. The second one is that European leaders managed to convince themselves that Russia basically do not fear really the West. It's much more talk, and Russia much more fears China and basically the radical Islam on the southern part. So from this point of view, when the Russians are basically complaining, position of the European Union was it's a talk. They know that we are not a problem because they know that we are reasonable and vegetarian power. And from this point of view, we cannot be a threat for anybody. And this was very strong on the level of the European elites. What they didn't manage to recognize was that in a certain way, Russia was not so much scared about its territorial integrity, but much more about the political sustainability of the regime and basically how it can be undermined. And thirdly, because the Europeans were seeing all these Russian elites coming, talking money, spending money, and so on, they were absolutely sure that these elites are not going to do anything that is going to hurt their own business interests. This was also a wrong estimation of the situation, because these elites, as corrupt as they are, they have been also very much dreaming about different Russia's role in the world. I do believe that the interesting story was that, in my view at least, Russian behavior should be better understood in the terms of the Russian domestic politics, and basically also how Putin read what happened during the Russia winter protest of 2012. One of the things that is very difficult for the Western analysts to believe, but at least of everybody I have been talking to on the Russian side, it's true. Mr. Putin is strongly convinced that any type of a protest that you're going to see in the world is organized by somebody's intelligence. This is a very strong police vision of history. He does not believe that things can happen spontaneously. It's true for Moscow, it's true for Kiev, it's true for Hong Kong. So for him, this was a covert operations, very much going after regime change. And to be honest, the fact that the Western politicians jumped and said, oh, we contributed very much to this, probably helps him to believe this. So this impossibility to believe in the genuine nature of any political protest also explains part of his behavior. But he made two also major miscalculations in his reaction. And his biggest miscalculation was Germany. I do believe that the idea that Germany is going to support Russia over this was based on the fact that he didn't understand that for the European Union, for Germany, on the leading position in the EU, what was the Ukrainian crisis was very much about European Union. If Germany is going to allow countries like Poland or the Baltic states to feel totally isolated and left on their own, this was the end of the European project. So the tougher position of European Union was very much the result, not of the American toughness, but of the decision of Chancellor Merkel and the position of Germany. It was Germany who did it. And from this point of view, I do believe, and this is the last point I want to make, that this was the miscalculation of the Russian position. I do believe that, of course, we are living in a different world, and this conflict is a conflict that is going to tell us something about the future. Because in the future, we're going to see more and more type of a political protest which you don't know from where they're coming and you don't know where you're going. On one way, European Union being a normative power is very much in the idea to endorse all this. European media is very much endorsing this. On the other, Russians basically want the world in which this type of a protest are going to be banned and disappeared. And this world cannot happen because especially with this type of new technologies and basically the cultural changes that happened, this world cannot happen anymore. So from this point of view, it's not a Cold War. It's a totally different situation because now this is the instability within the states and not the competition between the states that explains this instability.
Normally, the British people start with yes, but. I will be very French and say no, but. So it's not the Cold War reboot, but I would like just to present sort of or continue the story of Ukraine being caught in the crossfire of integration. And what Ivan said about being sort of two integration projects going on in the post-Soviet space. But I would also, I've just come back from Moldova, where it's not Nigel Farage, but it's actually poor sort of EU technocrats in Moldova who made me very Eurosceptic. But here, I'm back in London, and I'll actually say that the EU is very much taken by surprise, and it's hardly to blame for something which Ukraine demanded from it, i.e. the new contractual framework, the new agreement. Every single president of Ukraine wanted closer integration with the EU up to the membership perspective. They started knocking on the door of the EU in 1998. It was President Kuchma who started and continued by President Yushchenko, and then President Yanukovych went as far as stopping the negotiations on the association agreement and asking for the membership perspective to be put in the association agreement. Needless to say, the EU refused, being very fatigued of enlargement, and especially not wanting to have this sort of messy and badly governed country like Ukraine with an, really sort of fledgling autocrat in charge of it, joining the waiting room for EU enlargement. So the EU was very much taken by surprise, almost but it was also very passive. If you ask anybody who was on the Maidan, they would think the EU did very little. And US officials actually put it in very verbal or vocal way. But as Will also said, it started as the Euromaidan, it became the Maidan. In Ukraine now people talk about the Maidan, the right to rebel against an increasingly oppressive authorities. So we have the right to rebel versus the very statist approach to which Ivan alluded, positivist approach that any formal laws, regardless to what extent they respect human rights, are good enough and they legitimize whatever actions the government wants to take. And in Ukraine, it was the draconian laws of the 16th of January which started the violent phase of the protest. And I was in Ukraine in September just before. And I made I had at least in my head, some disparaging thoughts about the Ukrainians, how passive they are and how they're prepared to accept this sort of Central Asian type of sultanic regime which President Yanukovych built in Ukraine. 50% of public contracts went to his son's company in January of this year. This is basically how corrupt Ukraine became. Every single aspect of Ukraine, whether from the road police, corporate governance, and Amnesty International wrote a very damning report. Basically, you could leave a building, be arrested outside, and your business would be taken by someone close to the government. This is how bad things were in Ukraine. But many people discovered Ukraine as a result of the crisis, not just when the Maidan started. And the issue of the constitutional framework and what constitutes the coup d'etat is very important. According to the 1996 constitution of Ukraine, if there is no president, if he flees the country, then the Speaker of the Parliament becomes the acting president. And the fact that the Party of Regions, the so-called the Party of Power of Ukraine, voted for that, the whole people, the members of parliament who have voted in parliament, voted for that solution for the Speaker of the Parliament to become the acting president, actually, from the constitutional point of view, legitimizes the decision. So it hardly can be viewed a coup d'etat. At the same time, the presence of the three European leaders, the French, German, and Polish, they were actually there in a fairly moderate form. There's a very interesting exchange between them when the Ukrainian opposition leaders at the time were unhappy with the compromise decision allowing President Yanukovych to stay in power for another year when he had blood on his hands. Basically, Sikorski, knowing how he's outspoken, the Polish foreign minister, knowing how he's outspoken, said, if you don't accept it, you'll be killed. It was as simple as that. So they were hardly promoting the coup d'etat, but actually rather taken by surprise. We have so much groaning, moaning about the EU inside the EU, that actually having people killed on the streets of a neighboring country in the name of European values was a bit of shock to all people in Europe. But the concept of this post-war, somehow the Maidan and the change of government in Ukraine violated this post-Cold War settlement. And for me, I come from Poland, and part of Western Ukraine was historically Polish. But after the Vilnius summit, when President Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement, Poland didn't go on to annex Western Ukraine. It was somehow now we talk about the spheres of influence. The new Monroe Doctrine now applies to the Putin's doctrine. So it is a messy bipolar world. But it also, the issue boils down, do we accept sovereignty of the countries and their right to determine their foreign policy? And then we have to accept that even President Yanukovych at no point agreed to join the Russian integration project. And he's still insisted on the European choice. Or do we actually accept that we have the spheres of influence in Europe? But ultimately, I think the discourse of blaming the EU, EU technocrats who are blindfolded into this whole geopolitical mess, I think legitimizes the policy of annexation and aggression in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Tara, I'd like to come to you first of all. I thought Katerina ended well to set up my question to you. Aren't you legitimising Putin's annexation? And can you spell out a bit more about why you thought the European intervention amounted to a coup d'etat?
Well, no, I guess I wouldn't really see that. I mean, I think it's obviously in these debates in which one is trying to make a strong point in a short time, it can often seem that one is, I don't think it is being pro-Putin to try and understand the roots of the crisis. I mean, I just don't really understand that. As I said, it's not to say that Putin is a great guy, but how do we understand who precipitated the crisis in the first place? It just seems to me, when one just reads the accounts of what happened in the Ukraine, I mean, not in any kind of conspiratorial way, but this, the media accounts, if three foreign ministers who essentially took it upon themselves, go to Kiev and more or less tell the sitting head of government, you've got to clear off, and then warned the opposition that if they don't sign up to it, they will be shot in the streets. Not by the EU, obviously, but, you know. I cannot really characterise this in any other way than as a sort of soft coup, quite simply.
Okay, we'll have plenty of time for applause later on, but you do feel free to
Can I make
burst into spontaneous.
just a footnote? No, this
No,
is
Ivan,
Mr. Lukin was also there. There was also a president of the Russian Federation on the talks. He decided at the end not to sign, but the conversation have been between Yanukovych, 3 European ministers, and the representative of the Russian Federation.
yes, I'm sure we'll come back to the three foreign ministers. In of itself, it's quite interesting that the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, who's been very involved. Poland is very involved because of its geography, because of its history, that Sikorski couldn't go by himself as a representative of the European Union, and indeed he actually wanted to take the job of being the sort of high representative for foreign affairs. He had to be accompanied by Steinmeier because they were a bit worried, and because Steinmeier was going, of course, the French had to go too, because you can't trust the Germans when it comes down to Russia. So the moment with the three foreign ministers is interesting in all kinds of ways, because clearly Europe was intervening in the events that were going on in Kiev, but it was intervening in a sort of rather chaotic way that perhaps showed some of the levels of mistrust between European powers. But Will, I wanted to ask you, I'm very intrigued by you saying you were in Donetsk when all was well, and then later on when the conflict had broken out. It'd be quite good for you to tell us a little bit, because this is one of the striking features about the former Yugoslavia, where suddenly divisions and armed groups emerged, where before there had just been, people living happily alongside each other. So it'd be just quite good if very quickly you can give us a flavour, and perhaps if you talk to people in Donetsk 1 and then the same people in Donetsk 2 about how they saw these divisions as emerging.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the divisions between East and West are kind of well documented and go back many, many years. And, if you look at the kind of opinion polls that have been conducted in Ukraine ever since independence, it's clear that you've got these kind of very different opinions on each side. But actually, it's interesting because there was sort of a split within a split in the East, because what we often found was that in terms of support for the protest movement, and this was obviously a new protest movement against the new government in Ukraine, which had been a protest movement against the old government in Ukraine. So what you often found is you would have sort of the intellectuals, the business people, and the students and the football fans on the side of a united Ukraine. And then on the other hand, you'd have the miners, the working class, the pensioners, the military and the police, who were on the other side, on the more pro-Russian side. So there was actually, it wasn't sort of all of the East love Russia and all of the West love Europe. But, when you boil down to it, it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Okay. One of the things I want to carry on exploring then is that you said, Ivan, that and you sort of bore it out a little bit as well, Katerina, that a lot of this was about instability within states, and you were saying that it's important that instability within states can give rise to new politics, reformist movements, pro-European movements, and it's important that those countries have the sovereignty to do that. You mentioned, Ivan, the geopolitical ambiguity of Ukraine in 2008, when just after the Georgia crisis there was discussion about Ukraine joining NATO, etc. And the ambiguity meant that decision was effectively delayed almost permanently. So I'd like to ask you, Katerina, is it really just instability within the Ukraine when you have that reform movement which becomes very politicized by external powers. And obviously we sort of expect in one sense that it could become politicized by Russia, because Russia's always made its position vis-a-vis Ukraine very, very clear, but it did seem to become politicized by external elements. So is it really just instability within the Ukraine when you have very high-profile Western leaders, including Mr. Sikorski, going and speaking to protesters on the Maidan, and it begins to assume a slightly different character? So can we really look at the Maidan and say that was instability within a state and not instability in which other states then became involved, giving it a new dynamic and in one sense fueling the paranoia of a very defensive Putin? So could I ask you, Katerina, on that?
Right. Yeah, was it self-made or was it imported? And I think it's paradoxical because the Orange Revolution, which was peaceful, very, nice colors, it was like a long-lasting rock concert in comparison to the Maidan, it was actually imported. There was training provided by EU embassies in Ukraine and was mainly Serbian and Georgian activists training Ukrainian activists in peaceful protest techniques. And sort of the Orange Revolution was peaceful because the authorities basically recognized people's powers at the time, and they were not prepared to escalate, to resort to violence. Thanks to interventions from both sides, actually, from the EU and Russia, the Maidan was different. But it can be traced to a single, basically, Facebook post by the Ukrainian journalist of Afghan origin, Mustafa Nayem, who basically called people to protest about Yanukovych abandoning the association agreement. And the people on the Maidan, they said to me when I interviewed people actually about it, they say it was like a university reunion. 60% of people on the Maidan had higher education degree. It was like meeting your university mates. And it was, when we look at public opinion surveys throughout, it was basically broadly pro-European part of society tended to be younger and better educated. The exception was Western Ukraine, where all stratas of society. So paradoxically, it was, talking in Britain about the class system, it was sort of this sort of vague class system which emerged in Ukraine, and the aspirations, as one Hong Kong protester said, and I really like that he captured it, it sounds stupid, but it's all about democracy and human rights. And for us fighting our sort of little European intra-EU battles, this perhaps, we're a bit complacent, but the people in Ukraine who are worse off, this is actually what it boiled down to. So the Maidan was much more, and I'm afraid the presence of the, whether American and European leaders, all the sort of axis went to the Maidan, they didn't change because there were, for example, nothing was done in terms of sanctions. The people in Ukraine who were in favor of the Maidan of reforms, they wanted sanctions. No sanctions were imposed until basically the Maidan was over. It only really sort of took off with the annexation of Crimea. So the Maidan, I am really sort of the intervention of the West. It was about de-escalation rather than escalation. And what is most interesting, that the bargain stuck between Yanukovych and the EU leaders was basically dismissed by the Maidan itself as insufficient, allowing someone with his basically hands in blood staying for another year in power.
Okay.
Can I just say something quickly?
Yeah.
This talk about foreign ministers going to Kiev, EU foreign ministers, and the accusations that Victoria Nuland was discussing who should take the presidency in the new Ukraine. Actually, these people, they didn't make the Maidan. The opposition leaders, some of the senior figures that EU and US officials met with in Kiev, they didn't make the Maidan. The Maidan was made by all those people. The government that was formed, the new government, as a result of the Maidan movement, actually, I think there was an opinion poll last week that said that 70% of people approve of the actions taken by the government so far. So it wasn't a kind of top-down thing, I don't think. Certainly from what I saw, and I've got to keep saying that, it wasn't a top-down thing. It was actually That's what the Maidan was. It was a mass grassroots movement.
Okay, but so I certainly wouldn't want to challenge the idea that there wasn't a mass grassroots movement, and one of the problems of geopolitical ambiguity and everyone wanting to dance around issues, and Ukraine, as I said, was discussed back in 2008 very substantially in the European Union without any real great result, is that whilst you have this grassroots movement, the Maidan, and maybe, these Europeans and these Americans who are going there have the best of motives. They've got this normative thing that, democracy protests, anti-corruption protests are good, and you want to support it, but you don't want it to become too polarised, and all the rest of it. But you don't really know what you're doing. You've got this ambiguity. You mistrust each other, and I like the way that you mentioned the Newland phone call. This was a Newland phone call where she was taped on her, presumably, mobile phone, which shows very sloppy security for a diplomat by the Russians.
They are very good at that.
Yes. Basically swearing about how useless, using the F word about the useless Europeans. But so when people are getting involved or relating to a spontaneous grassroots movement, and they've got this chaotic, mistrustful levels themselves, surely even that lends it a different quality in an ambiguous situation where the Americans are coming in and shouting and ranting, where the Europeans are doing a bit of theatre as well, and the Europeans don't trust each other. It gives it a character which is external. It's not just merely an instability within a state. Would you agree with that?
For sure. Listen, my only major point was it's going to be very naive to believe that either Russians or the West have been controlling the situation on the ground. Both sides have been playing around and trying to create, by the way, the image of being more important than they are. Because part of the story was that there was for 1 month in which nobody was controlling the situation in Ukraine. Is there external factor? Yes, on 3 levels. First, the very existence of the Ukraine, in the way it was, dysfunctional, corrupt government which everybody is ready to talk with, was based on a certain understanding of the European order, where basically Russia was not perceiving the European Union as a major threat. This was there. When you have 2 projects going on, when basically also Russia decided to have an integration project of its own, this was not possible anymore. From this point of view, it's not very different than Yugoslavia in 1991. During the Cold War, both sides have an interest for Yugoslavia to survive. After the end of the Cold War, nobody was interested in this. The same happened to Ukraine. This ambiguity was part of the post-Cold War European order, and this post-Cold War European order was very much eroded. To believe that what's happening there was simply because European politicians did do or that, or the Russians were controlling totally Yanukovych and telling him, kill this one or that one, I do believe it's a simplification which works well on the propaganda level, but it's not true. First, European ministers went to Ukraine because the newspapers and the televisions were covering this enormously, and they wanted much more to impress their own publics. In countries like Poland, where this is a real public issue, Mr. Sikorski went there because he cannot stay there because the opposition is going to tell him why you are not in Kiev. In the Russian side, very much the similar. To be honest, I do believe that Mr. Putin was really afraid that after losing Ukraine, he's going to see a street, but this street is not going to be the liberal Moscow street, but it's going to be the Russian nationalists who are not going to basically forgive him for losing Ukraine. And in October 2013, you have the highest level of anti-xenophobic sentiments being registered in Russia according to the Levada Center. So everybody has a problem of its own. And from this point of view, Ukraine is also very interesting because people say stabilizing, destabilizing. It's very difficult to destabilize dysfunctional state.
Tara, come in.
I really don't want to imply at all that I'm suggesting that the EU kind of created the genuine political disagreements in Ukraine. Quite the opposite. That's my point. The EU, of course, didn't make the protests in the Maidan. The point is, as Will said, and Katerina also in her work, you have a country which is very weak and in which there are genuine political disagreements, between East and West, and obviously that is oversimplifying it too. I accept that. But that's exactly the point. When you have this kind of very almost sort of accidental sort of meddling and intervention with no clear idea even of what the end point is, it is inevitably going to absolutely exacerbate the situation. And I just want to say a thought experiment. The question of, intervention, is it a coup, etc. Is it a coup? Okay, imagine if at the height of Occupy London, Putin, the Chinese foreign minister, and let's say the Belarusian foreign minister for good measure, went to St. Paul's and started going on about how illegitimate the coalition government was, or if there'd been any overt intervention in terms of the Scottish referendum. Now, I think that most states would react quite strongly to this, which isn't to justify anything, but it's just an obvious political point. And yet, when it comes to countries in Eastern Europe, and it was exactly the same in Yugoslavia, that the Yugoslavs were treated as, of course, how could they care what country they possibly lived in? It's almost like we imagine that kind of people living in the Ukraine or Yugoslavia are almost like pawns to be pushed. They can't possibly be bothered, what the name of the country is, what association they live in. But what I think the real important point is, Bruno, is that point about the kind of confusing, chaotic and accidental nature of EU foreign policy, in which there is absolutely no clear acceptance or understanding that when you intervene in a country, you set off a chain of events. I mean, my 3.5-year-old could work that out.
Thank you, Tara. Now, I want to come out to the audience, because we've heard a lot here on the panel, and there still seems to me to be quite a lot to clarify, and I think some good questions from the audience.
Do you think the annexation of Crimea is good for Crimeans, and why?
John Mearsheimer has argued that EU expansion caused fear in Moscow and precipitated Russia's annexation of Crimea, where you've got a key Russian naval base. If it's a new Cold War in the making, it doesn't appear to be one in the Cold War realist geopolitical framework. Would you like to comment on the implications of a potential new Cold War, but without the old or the former realist geopolitical framework?
I just wanted to know if the panel thought there was any difference in the way that the West discussed the Maidan protests and the way they discussed the later referendums which happened in the East, because it struck me that while Maidan was celebrated as kind of democratic moment, wonderful reinvigoration of democracy, the moment these Easterns, scary people from Russia start wanting to vote and having more autonomy, suddenly the whole thing, the way we talked about it, sort of mobs, mobs of people on the street demanding to vote. I just wondered if you saw a distinction there.
Yeah, it seemed quite striking to me at the time, the demonisation of Russia, for actually sort of what seemed to be a fairly straightforward response of a nation state to a nation on its border where it had key strategic interests being destabilised, a threat. It moved in, particularly co-opted a region that had been historically part of the country, and there were complexities there. That seemed fine. It seems to me the whole thing about the EU interaction was it wasn't very clear what its own interests were or what it was doing. It's not like the West is not involved in interventions historically, but it seemed very unclear about it. So what I want to know is, in terms of this being the shape of 21st century politics, whether there was any kind of distinction between the EU not really being a clear nation state in terms of acting on its own interests and trying to act in a more general sense, which you think has led to that crisis of interest, or whether there's something else going on there.
I take the view that Tara took, and that's essentially that it was a meddling operation by the EU. And one of the great, which simply ignored, as I think David here said, that countries have their vested interests, and Russia had an interest in Ukraine. In fact, the origin of Russia was Kiev, Rus. And for us to sort of come in and muddle about it and try and influence it, I think was awful. The other quick point is I think the EU intrinsically is a disaster, because whatever happens, you've got 28 ministers who all get together. And in essence, that was Ivan's point. The Poles are sort of looking at their constituency. And so whatever happens, you suddenly get all these ministers coming along, and each grandstanding to try and sound tougher than the rest. And in terms of international politics, it's a disaster.
Anyone on the panel who got a burning desire to come back?
I've got a couple of...
Well, one of the things I'd like to ask you, because it seems to be a point related to some of the things you can say, and you can say whether this is what people sort of felt on the ground. It does seem to be a certain double standard in terms of the West saying, Medan, go for it, you know, democracy on the streets and all the rest of it, and then a rather different standard applied in terms of sort of the Crimea. Is that a legitimate double standard?
You mean the East?
The East.
Well, not really, because I think the difference between Maidan and the Eastern protests is, you know, the Maidan was non-violent, largely non-violent, and the East, from the very beginning, these were armed men, you know, and there was, I mean, the whole reason that Ukraine launched its so-called anti-terrorist operation, which was the military operation to retake the East from the separatists, was when a local politician in Donetsk was found, he was abducted and tortured and murdered. So, you know, there's a difference there in the kind of methods that they use, but also I think the legality of it, because, I mean, I agree with Katerina in terms of the legality of the overthrow of, I shouldn't have used that word considering my point, but the removal of Yanukovych, because, you know, he fled, he ran away. No one arrested him or, you know, he fled, and according to the Ukrainian constitution, the parliament then becomes the senior executive body. So, you know, I think that, you know, you could say that was a largely legal process, whereas the East clearly wasn't. I mean, you know, the very idea of holding a referendum in a region that, you know, is at war and having 2 weeks to prepare it without any sort of, you know, kind of framework is mental, frankly. So I think, you know, in terms of the methods, that differentiates the two.
Ivan, you wanted to come
Very
back?
quick. I have a sympathy with your argument that we believe that everything in Kiev is spontaneous and nothing in Donbass could be spontaneous. This is as idiotic as basically believing that everything in Kiev was organized by the West. Concerning the interest in the geopolitical reading, listen, it's very difficult to use interest. For sure, Russia has an interest in Ukraine. But how are you going to stop the Poles to believe that they have an interest in Lviv? If you start with this type of a dynamics, you're going to go with the fragmentation of any nation state. And from this point of view, I do believe here is the problem. And the last point was where I see the weakness of the European policy. Because it was symbolic politics. We were doing certain things simply because the Russians are telling us that we should not do them. And this is the problem, because this reactive symbolic politics makes non-strategic, not the intervention, because this is my last point. Listen, doing something, you start a chain of events. Not doing certain things, you also start a chain of events.
The point about, you know, the EU going and meddling in an area that is Russia's property is what you seem to be saying. Ukraine is an independent nation. In 1991, 90% of Ukrainians voted to become an independent nation. And this whole thing about a post-Cold War consensus, you know, assuming there was some sort of agreement between Russia and the West saying that there won't be any NATO expansion eastwards. I mean, there's no evidence that that ever took place. I mean, that was just, that the Russians have always said, oh, there was agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan or whoever it was to say, yeah, okay, disband the Soviet Union and we won't expand NATO eastwards. But I mean, we don't know that. We're just taking the Russians' word on that, really.
There were discussions in the late 1990s, in 97, about whether there'd be a permanent NATO base in Poland, for example, and the West backed away to the horror of the Poles, who had a different understanding, a brigade at least. Let's come back to the audience. We're going to start with a little group of questions here.
I think you can't really understand this without understanding going back in time. In particular, one of the key developments has been which you might call the encirclement of Russia post-Cold War, and the way in which NATO has expanded, as well as the West, into these territories. And I thought it was interesting that Henry Kissinger came out against what the West was doing, you know, from a more realpolitik point of view, and was saying that really the solution was Finlandization, really, which I would see as more sovereignty for the Ukraine. And I would say that even if the ministers never turned up or anything like that happened directly, the fact that the EU made an ultimatum posed that question very directly as outside interference and had to be seen in that context. So the question I'd have is really, you know, to what extent does the panel think, if they accept some of my premises, why has the West adopted this approach rather than the old-style geopolitics approach?
Like people always blame Israel for everything, but if you look at the numbers, America's much bigger. I don't think it's an insult to Ukraine to describe it as a basket case, and therefore it seems very unlikely to me that its own internal divisions or the Ukraine itself was the substance of the problem. It seems to me, if you just look at the economics, the EU, and to a lesser extent Russia, must have been the dominating power. And if you look at a particular expression of that, which is around gas, which hasn't come up yet, just wondered if the panel would care to come back on whether that was a dimension of it all, given Germany's obsession with energy policy, gas, and all the rest of it.
I am of the opinion that some people on the platform are really underestimating the role of the EU and especially Germany. I mean, Germany, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, built up financially and politically, educationally, one of the leading opposition politicians, namely the Boxer, whatever he's called. A lot of very serious people, academics, are saying that there is no other option for Ukraine than to relate both to Europe and Russia. That's the only way to maintain stability in a country that's so internally divided. And European policy should have realized that this is the case and that the kind of actions they took were really going to destroy the country. Don't you agree with that?
3 points that I think will not very touch. I would like to thank Will for stressing the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign country, because sometimes both the West and of course Russia forget about it. So the Budapest memorandum proved, basically Ukraine, give away your nuclear weapon and the UK, the US and Russia will, protect your borders. And then the annexation of Crimea occurred, and the West just said it was a memorandum, not a treaty. So that would lead me to my second point, which I think we did not touch this issue about the ethical role that the West has had or has not had so far, because we talk about European values, but at the same time we have France is selling the Mistrals and which end up being the weapons that are going to kill Ukrainian citizens. And basically, I wanted just to and another thing that nobody ever talks about is the particular history that Ukraine had. Basically, it never had a strong statehood. And in Europe, if you don't have a strong statehood, you're considered basically a second-class citizenship. And so, your reflection, and just a super quick thing, it's a quote by an Italian Slavist who said that the destiny of Europe depends on the relationship between Germany and Russia, and the destiny of the world depends on the relationship between the US and Russia. What do you think about this, taking into account today's weak US leadership?
Thank you.
Maybe the EU was complicit in the Maidan, maybe it wasn't. Does it really matter? Isn't it actually, shouldn't it be the policy of the EU to be taking every measure necessary to contain Russian influence in the East?
Okay, behind you.
Thank you. It's a very informative discussion, but I wanted to ask the panelists to pull away a bit from the Russia-West seesaw and think maybe a bit about a bigger picture. So what struck me was when Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the United Nations, stood up in the UN Security Council to condemn Russia for its aggression and interference in the sovereignty of another member state, how totally bankrupt and incredible it was for the US to be able to say that. So it seems to me what Katerina said was right. We live in an age in which states, large states, strong states, are preying on weaker states, annexations and protectorates are back. But that began in Europe, in the Balkans, with NATO and the European Union. And the Russians have simply returned the message in the same form in which they received it.
This conflict has a lot of echoes of the beginning of 1914, except from the financial markets point of view, I would say that war has already started. It's not being fought really with bullets, but it's been fought with oil and with finance. I'd be interested in your comments on that and the panel's view on if this effectively world war with finance and oil is being fought, how would the panel advise the various governments in order to step back from it?
Okay, I'm going to have a couple of people on the panel. I want to look at this idea of normative foreign policy living alongside, as Phil in the audience, related to this sort of very interventionist West, where the West has been creating protectorates and dismembering member states, countries such as Serbia and Kosovo. Katerina. Do you want to come back on any of these points?
Right. I think the issue infallibility of borders is very important. I come from Gdańsk in northern Poland. It was a German city. And I have shivers down my spine, basically, when we talk about borders. What about Strasbourg? What about Kaliningrad? We may not like what goes in neighboring states, but quite a different situation from actually taking over the territory of sovereign states, whatever historical titles we may have. And I think in Europe, this, given how recent many of the borders are, I think that really sets very unpleasant precedent. The issue of NATO, that was a non-issue in Ukraine. President Yanukovych opted for neutrality, basically putting on a shelf. People were largely against. What we have now, it had nothing to do with NATO, basically. But now the people of Ukraine are afraid, and the popularity of NATO is rising. And it's exactly what we don't, in a way, didn't want. In Moldova, basically, neutrality whatsoever. Russia is punishing Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, in the same way that it is currently doing with Ukraine. The final point is about power of attraction. And I think asymmetry in the power of attraction. Imagine living between sort of a very powerful but messy, perhaps drunk, sorry for the stereotypical representation, neighbor, and a well sort of neatly Germanic-style organized, neighbor, and you have to choose where do you go. And one is sort of rule-abiding, another one is playing with rules. And this is the choice that Ukraine faced, very unpleasant, but in the end, it had to make a choice.
Okay. Tara, can you come back on?
Yeah, just
can you show your hands as well, people who still want to
on that point, I mean, just briefly, you had to, I can't remember, was it Kerry or someone who made the quote, you had to laugh, saying a country in the 21st century can't go around annexing other countries and establishing protectorates, etc. Slightly ironic, but absolutely Putin talking about human rights and sovereignty as an excuse for the annexation, and I absolutely in no way think that the annexation has been good for Crimea or Russia or the EU. I think it's been a disaster all round, but Putin is absolutely reading from the Western script written in the responsibility to protect. We will go in order to restore sovereignty, to protect human rights. Absolutely. But just in terms of this, I just want to go back to what Evan is saying, because it is related about this idea of symbolic politics, and to go back to what Vanessa asked about new Cold War without geopolitics. I think this is what you end up. You have a sort of, it's not a Cold War, but a kind of conflict based on symbolic politics with no relationship to real politics on the ground, and with no sense really of limits, I guess. And that was the one thing about the Cold War, not that I yearn for the good old days of mutually assured destruction, but there was a genuine sense of danger and of limits. And once politics goes off into the kind of ethical, normative, symbolic realm, there is literally no understanding or even conception of where these things might end. And just finally, even, I know you say, of course, not doing something has consequences too, but had the EU not acted as it had done in the Ukraine, you may well have had a pretty messy situation in Ukraine, but you would not have had an international crisis. That would be my
Okay, you can't wait because you're going to be able to come back. We haven't got a couple more speakers, just fair.
I'm just fascinated that we're digging around so much about the situation in Ukraine, and no one on the panel actually elaborated a little bit on the Russian foreign policy of the last few decades, where in reality Ukrainian crisis today and the situation we have between Ukraine and Russia could have been prevented. Has Europe and maybe the rest of the world done something when Georgian war was happening, which is exactly one-to-one scenario that is happening in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, I'd just like to make three succinct points.
Succinct, yes.
Yeah. Firstly, people talk about the Ukrainian revolution as coming from below, when it seems to me it was politically, intellectually and financially sponsored by Europe. People talk about the Russians giving money and arms to the Eastern separatists, but who gives all the money and arms to the Ukrainian government? And slightly off at a tangent, does anyone still believe that NATO and the UN are worth a wank?
Just in terms of sort of Ukraine and the Cold War, we've discussed the causes and the EU's and Russia's interest in it. But what do you think? How will it get worse, or how can it be contained? So I just wanted your opinion on how the crisis will progress.
I'm surprised we did not talk about the relationship between Putin and the far-right parties in the EU, which is a huge problem.
Okay, the souverainiste and the love affair with Putin. Right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to sum up. I'm going to do it in the reverse order and really think about some of the things that people have been saying. Don't necessarily try and cover everything. Just take what you think are the most important points that have come up. It's your last moment to sort of look at the audience in the eye and to distill it for them, to win them, so to speak. So we're going to start in reverse order. So, Katharina.
Right. What is interesting, NATO given the new sense of purpose when it was lacking until the spring of this year. But what is paradoxical, what we had is the limited war. It was not the total war when sort of the countries came with their full power. Till today, Russia denies any kind of involvement. Those people in Russia who point to involvement are labeled foreign agents. Russia is very painfully avoiding being implicated officially, which actually gives reasons for hope, because it means that Russia doesn't want to go into total war, but it wants to be taken seriously. And someone said about a decade ago that the difference between Ukraine and Russia is that Ukraine wants to be included in the West, despite all the domestic divisions, whereas Russia wants to be on a par with the West. And this is sort of where the tensions came over the association agreement. But the limited war, with the threat, with the troops, Russian troops at the Ukrainian border in the background, I think is actually quite comforting, however perverse it may sound, because it means there was actually sort of limited investment of resources with a massive sort of propaganda machine, but not to have a war as such. Having said that, NATO has basically, NATO commanders, and I take the point from Ivan about it's the crisis in a particular country in Europe, but all the actors involved upload the agenda. And NATO sort of commanders basically now having this sort of license to spend for the wrong reasons. How the ordinary sort of troops, ground troops, are going to fight in such a limited war. NATO is not prepared and doesn't seem to be sort of prepared for the kind of sort of postmodern sort of threats that Europe may face. And the final issue, the Georgian crisis, was it a wake-up call? I think Georgia has made it, we had this discussion about Ukraine, there was massive discussion about Georgia 2008, and the fact that it was Saakashvili first who ordered shelling of the territories, I think made it very difficult. And the crisis, the context is always very sort of context specific. How do we perceive what happens? And the Caucasus is very far away in comparison to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Ivan, if you could come in, but I was very intrigued with something you said though, which sort of rang true for me when you said that people were with Ukraine guilty of doing things just because Russia doesn't like it. If you could spell that out, that sounds interesting.
There was one, in my view, paradox with the post-Cold War European order, which we should basically articulate clearly in order to know where it comes from. Post-Cold War European order was a deal not between Russia and the West, but between the Soviet Union and the West. And Soviet Union, unlike Russia, was getting the idea of the soft sovereignty much more positively, because for them, this was the way to keep the country together. Mr. Gorbachev liked the anti-nationalistic rhetoric of the European Union, because for him, this was the way to fight the nationalists within the Soviet Union. It didn't work. And in my view, this is very, very important, because from this point of view, Russia has a different type of an identity structure, different type of objectives than the Soviet Union. It's a different player. Secondly, and for me, this is also important, when you're making a state, there is economy, there is this and that, but it's also the nationalistic sentiment. Nobody has made a state out of certain mobilization of the nationalistic sentiment. The paradox of the post-Soviet space is that much of the trade relations and cultural connections are based on the relations to Moscow, but the nationalism in the post-Soviet space is anti-Russian. This is not something. For Ukraine, it's much more painful because of the nature of the relationship, but this is what we saw in Kiev. It's not pro-European. It was much more anti-Russian, honestly speaking. I have been on the street after a certain point. And this makes the situation kind of much more, this is simply a classical nationalistic, and I'm not saying it negatively, this is true for any of the countries, this is how you're making nations. And then on the US, EU, Russia, there is one major difference. United States basically does not have major economic relations with Russia. So for the United States to be tough on Russia does not have economic cost. From this point of view, it's very different than China. And in a certain way, honestly speaking, also because of the Israeli issue, it's much easier to be tougher on Russia than on Iran. So from the domestic point of view, this is a kind of a much easier political game. And now I go for the last point, and this is basically how you're ending and where you... Listen, there is a nice saying of the American politician from the 1990s when people talk Cold War and everybody was talking about bears, Russia is a bear. He said, when you're dancing with a bear, you're not quitting when you're tired. You quit when the bear is tired. I'm saying this because I do believe one thing that European Union should do at the moment is to recognize the Eurasian Union as a legitimate project on the Russian side. Ukraine is not going to be part of this project. But Russia has the right of project of its own. Part of the arrogance on the European side was that we believed that there is only one project possible. We believed that we're universalistic at everything which we're doing. Now we simply discovered that we're exceptional. On the other side, we're very much in our right to defend what we have. And it's also not up to Mr. Putin, basically, to make a deal with the parties within the European Union in the same way he's unhappy people doing his own domestic politics.
Okay, thank you very much. Will, if you come back, one of the things that Ivan has just said, which I heard repeated a lot by journalists who'd been there and by some of the officials and diplomats involved, was that the Maidan protests were less pro-European than anti-Russian. Is that something you picked up at all? And any comments you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, when covering the Maidan protests, there was very little anti-Russian sentiment there. I mean, people did mention it sometimes that, you know, maybe we want a closer relationship with Europe than our traditional, you know, sort of mother country. But the anti-Russian sentiment that is now mainstream political discourse in Kiev only started, quite understandably, after Russia invaded them. So just on the point that Ivan was making about the Eurasian Union versus the European Union, for me, what's quite interesting and maybe makes it quite tricky to compare them is that with the Eurasian Union, you know, Russia is trying to force or coerce states into joining, whereas the European Union, you could argue, you know, probably tries to attract states more. I guess the Eurasian Union is the sort of hard power bloc, and the EU is more of the soft power bloc. And actually, it was also interesting what Phil was saying. He was saying about Kosovo, and Kosovo is actually something that crept up again and again and again. You know, pro-Russians and Russians alike would cite it as one of their sort of main bugbears. You know, Kosovo for a lot of people was the moment when they really lost faith in the Western system.
It was also Putin's justification for Georgia.
Yes.
As well.
Yes. I mean, Kosovo was just a massive slap in the face to the Russians. Yeah, I agree with Katerina about Georgia not really being the same, although it was a kind of seminal moment in East-West relations. Yeah, Saakashvili did launch the first shots, and you know, we have subsequently seen that Saakashvili actually was not a Democrat, and I think is quite mad. I think it's safe to say. But I mean, I'm no fan of the EU. I hope it hasn't come across in the course of this discussion that I think EU foreign policy is like top drawer, because I think most people, including me, on a purely personal basis, would agree that the West policy towards Russia and the region in general has been, you know, wrong-headed since the fall of the Soviet Union. Western leaders failed to demonstrate sufficient respect towards Russia, and the complete lack of understanding of Russia's, you know, millennia-old fear of encirclement. And of course, by that I have in mind encirclement in form of NATO expansion and EU association agreements. But also, as I said, high-handed foreign adventures such as Kosovo and Iraq. You know, Iraq was a major issue for Putin. And again, you know, he dispatched his top foreign policy advisors to negotiate with Saddam and the Americans, and the Americans just completely ignored the Russians, just like they did in Kosovo. And Libya, everyone knows that, of course, the Russians abstained Libya in a rare moment of sort of, you know, not agreement, but something coming close to agreement on Libya because they were under the impression that it was just going to be a no-fly zone, i.e. no planes in the sky. But actually, of course, it turned into lots of bombs falling from planes in the sky. And, you know, several gestures and overtures on the part of Russia towards the West, especially in the early years of the Putin administration, went completely unanswered and ignored. And I think we're kind of paying the price now. And I think it's quite. I thought it's hilarious actually to reread some of the press reports from when the Baltic countries, which obviously also were part of the Soviet Union, read some of the press reports of the time when the Baltics joined the EU, because people were saying, you know, should we be worried about Russia? And basically the consensus was no, because the Russian military is in such a terrible shape that they could never do anything about it. And of course now the Russian military is in quite a good shape and can invade countries as it pleases.
Tara, I'm going to bring you in last. Something you said was interesting, which was this normative foreign policy, sort of rather bloodless, can be very, very technical, and one of the criticisms that I heard a very senior British diplomat make of the EU in the Ukraine was it viewed it bloodlessly and just a technical sort of part of ticking the boxes of neighbourhood policy. But you went a bit further to talk about this new sort of rather limitless, symbolic foreign policy. And one of the most alarming things perhaps I find about this current discussion is the way in which Putin has become the symbol of everything that's wrong. He's sort of homophobic. He locked up Pussy Riot. Of course, he'd let him go again a little bit later on. He takes his top off and poses with dead animals and guns. He's almost like the ideal sort of anti-symbol for the West, and that seems as if it could actually be quite dangerous. So, Tara, if you could...
Yeah, well, I would agree, absolutely. I would argue EU foreign policy is, at the moment, and has been since the end of the Cold War, a seriously dangerous and destabilising force. I think there is a real problem. The kind of normative foreign policy, which is absolutely based on a kind of moral grandstanding, is a really problematic foreign policy. I don't know if I want to say more problematic than Cold War foreign policy. You know, the Cold War was a pretty big potential problem. But there is something very dangerous in terms of a foreign policy that explicitly refuses to accept that there are genuine material political differences, which is, to go back to the Ukraine, what I'd say existed in the Ukraine, which was then kind of internationalized and completely blown up as a result of this sort of normative, ethical, grandstanding foreign policy. And I think we've seen it in Yugoslavia. I think we've seen it in Libya. Absolute disaster. We saw the same kind of impetus. And I think now we're seeing it in Ukraine. And I think we'll see it in Syria as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like everyone to give our panel a big hand. Thank you.